Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Arunachala Ramanaya. The fifth question in this series, again this is a question that I was asked in one of the comments on a video on my YouTube channel. Someone wrote, "I'm still confused. Who is aware? I thought it was ego that is the only one thing that is aware. It's the reflected consciousness. When I say I'm aware of these thoughts, these feelings, these emotions, this body, this mind, who's really aware? Isn't it really the false awareness ego? Yes, I understand, but I understand underneath the underlying assumed reality is the real self, but we don't really realize that until we annihilate ego completely. Until then, everything is ego. Can you please expound on this?" That is, what is actually aware is our real nature. But our real nature is pure awareness. That means it's awareness that is not aware of anything other than itself. Why is it not aware of anything other than itself? Because nothing other than itself actually exists. So, in the clear view of ourself as pure awareness, there is nothing other than ourself. But now we have risen as ego. And as ego we are still aware, because awareness is our real nature, but instead of being aware of ourself as we actually are, in other words, instead of being aware of ourself alone, we are now aware, firstly we're aware of ourself as if we were a body, so we're aware of ourself as not just I am, but I am this body. And we are consequently aware of the seeming existence of other things. So what is aware of anything other than itself is ego. So what is aware of thoughts, feelings, emotions, body, mind, world, everything, that is ego. What is aware I am, and only I am, that is our real nature. But we are now not aware just I am, we're aware, firstly we're aware I am this body, and consequently we're aware of the seeming existence of so many other things. This awareness is a false awareness. Why is it a false awareness? Firstly, being aware of ourselves as I am this body is false because this body is not what we actually are. What we actually are is only I am. So being aware of ourselves as I am this or I am that is a false awareness. Moreover, this body and all the other things that we're aware of, being aware of this body and being aware of all other things is also a false awareness because none of these things actually exist. When we're aware of anything other than ourselves, those other things seem to exist. So by being aware of anything other than ourselves, we are aware of ourselves, we're aware of things that do not exist as if they exist. So being aware of what doesn't exist as if it exists is not real awareness. It's only a semblance of awareness. That is why it's called Chidabhasa. Abhasa means a semblance or a likeness. So though ego seems to be aware, it's not the real awareness. The real awareness is only the fundamental awareness I am. Awareness of anything other than I am is only a semblance of awareness because it's being aware of what doesn't exist as if it exists. That is not real awareness. Real awareness is being aware of what actually exists. And what actually exists is only ourself as pure awareness. So being aware of anything other than ourself is a false awareness or a semblance, a likeness of awareness, but not actual awareness, not awareness as it actually is. So yes, this, who is aware? It is, this person who wrote the question says, I thought it was ego that is the only thing that is aware. Yes, ego is the only thing that is aware in the sense of it is the only thing that is aware of anything other than itself. It is the reflected consciousness. Yes, Chidabhasa means the semblance of a likeness of awareness or likeness of consciousness, but it also means reflected. It's in the sense that it's a reflected image of awareness. If we see our face in a mirror, we are not seeing ourselves, we are seeing a likeness of ourselves, an image of ourselves. So in that sense, ego is a reflected consciousness or reflected awareness, in the sense that it's a reflected image of awareness. It's not pure awareness as it actually is, because as it actually is, awareness is not aware of anything other than itself. But it's a likeness of awareness because it is aware, but it's aware of what doesn't actually exist as if it exists. When I say I'm aware of these thoughts, these feelings, these emotions, this body, this mind, who's really aware? It is only ego. Isn't it really the false awareness, ego? Yes, absolutely. Yes, I understand that underneath the underlying assumed reality is the real self. That is what this person means by assumed reality. It's not, that is, we assume that this body and world are real. They seem to us to be real. So long as we're aware of them, they seem to exist. And so long as they seem to exist, they seem to be real. But they don't actually exist. They are not actually real. So generally we refer to this world as, people, philosophers, scientists and others, they refer to this world as reality. But what they take to be real is actually not real. We all take it to be real. This world seems to us to be real, but this is not reality. Reality is only our own real nature, pure awareness. That alone is what actually exists. Bhagavan clarified what is meant by real and unreal. Real means what actually exists. Unreal means what does not actually exist, even if it seems to exist. So this body and world and ego do not actually exist. They seem to exist, but just because they seem to exist doesn't mean they actually exist. So because they do not actually exist, they are unreal. What actually exists is only ourself as pure awareness. So that alone is real. But so long as we see this body and world, they seem to be real. So what is the reality underlying this seeming reality? This seeming reality that is unreal. That is, all this entire world seems to be real. It seems to exist in whose view? Only in the view of ourself as ego. So the world derives its seeming existence or seeming reality from the seeming existence or seeming reality of ourself as ego. But ego itself is unreal, because whatever appears and disappears, whatever exists at one time and not at another time, doesn't actually exist even when it seems to exist. This is something Bhagavan often used to say, and it is a principle implied by Sri Krishna, Bhagavan Krishna in the Gita. In chapter 2, verse 16, he says, there is no existence of what doesn't exist, and there is no non-existence of what does exist. So what does he mean by that? What doesn't exist, if there's no existence ever for what doesn't exist, that means what doesn't exist can never exist. And since there's no non-existence for what does exist can never not exist. That means only what exists eternally actually exists. Anything that doesn't exist eternally, but seems to exist at one time and not at another time, doesn't actually exist even when it seems to exist. So this is something Bhagavan often used to say. This is that verse of Bhagavad Gita of Bhagavad Gita, chapter 2, verse 16, Bhagavan has translated in Tamil as verse 9 of Bhagavad Gita Saram, the essence of the Bhagavad Gita. That's 42 verses that he selected from the Bhagavad Gita and translated into Tamil. So Bhagavan often used to explain the inference of that verse by saying, what exists at one time and not at another time doesn't actually exist even when it seems to exist. Gaudapada also says the same in the Mandukya Karika. I think in chapter 2, verse 6, if I remember correctly, of the Mandukya Karika, he says, what doesn't exist at the beginning and doesn't exist at the end necessarily doesn't exist in the middle. So it's different ways of saying the same thing. So what actually exists must always exist. Therefore, anything that comes into existence and ceases to exist doesn't actually exist. It merely seems to exist. So this whole world appears and disappears. So it doesn't actually exist. So from where does it derive its seeming existence? Since it seems to exist only in the view of ourself as ego, it derives its seeming existence from ego. And ego doesn't actually exist because it appears in waking and dream, it disappears in sleep. So it comes into existence in waking and dream, it ceases to exist in sleep. Since it doesn't exist always, it doesn't actually exist even when it seems to exist. So ego itself is a mere seeming existence. So all other things derive their seeming existence from the seeming existence of ourself as ego. But where did this ego derive its seeming existence from? Only from the real existence of ourself as I am, as the pure awareness I am. So what underlies the appearance of all this seeming existence is the actual existence, which is our own existence I am. So when this person says, yes, I understand that underneath the underlying assumed reality is the real self. That is, underlying the appearance of all this is the real self. That is our self as we actually are, the pure awareness I am. But we don't really realize that until we annihilate ego completely. Yes, so long as we are aware of ourself as I am this body, we are not aware of ourselves as we actually are. When we are aware of ourselves as we actually are, we can no longer be aware of ourselves as I am this body. So by being aware of ourselves as we actually are, we thereby annihilate ego. And by being aware of ourselves as we actually are, we thereby remain as we actually are. So as Bhagavan says, knowing ourselves alone is being ourselves. Knowing anything other than ourselves is not real knowing, because knowing anything other than ourselves is an active knowing. It's a mental activity to know anything other than ourselves. Whereas knowing ourselves is not an active knowing. That's why Bhagavan sometimes said, there's a verse in Maitava Vilakkam, a work of Muruganas. Sadhuam quotes this verse in one of the appendixes of the path of Sri Ramana. I think in the appendix when he explains the meaning of verses 9, 10, 11, 12, and there are several verses of Ulladu Napadu, in that he quotes one verse in which Muruganas says that I is such a knowledge that not only does not know other things, but does not know even itself. But he says it's a knowledge, it's an awareness. But so the fact it's an awareness, it does know. But why then does he say, Muruganas writes there, he's actually quoting what Bhagavan said. So why does Bhagavan say that we are such a knowledge, but not only doesn't know other things, but doesn't know ourselves? What he means by knowledge is awareness. So we are awareness, but doesn't know other things. We also don't know ourselves. What does he mean by saying we don't know ourselves? The whole aim of Bhagavan's teachings is for us to know ourselves. So why does he say our real nature doesn't know itself? What he means there is that we don't know ourselves by an act of knowing. Knowing anything else is an act of knowing. It's a thought. We know the world only by activity. That is, knowing anything other than ourselves is an activity of our mind. It's an act of knowing. But knowing ourselves is not an action. We know ourselves just by being ourselves. That is why Bhagavan says in verse 26 of Upadesha Undaya, Tanai iritale tanne aridalam. Being oneself alone is knowing oneself. So knowing ourself is quite different to all other knowings. All other knowings are a mental activity. Knowing ourself is not a mental activity. We know ourselves just by being ourselves. How do we know ourselves by being ourselves? Because what we actually are is pure awareness. So we can know pure awareness only by being pure awareness. So pure awareness doesn't know itself by an act of knowing, it knows itself just by being itself. And that is what we actually are. And then this person says, we don't really realize that until we annihilate ego completely. Until then, everything is ego. Yes, everything is ego, because all these things that what we are seeing as all this, we as ego are seeing ourselves as all this. None of this has any existence independent of ourselves as ego. That's why Bhagavan says in verse 26 of Uludunapadu, Ahande undayan anatamundahum. If ego comes into existence, everything comes into existence. Ahande indrail indru anatam. If ego doesn't exist, everything doesn't exist. Ahandeye yabamam. Ego itself is everything. Because what ego sees as everything is only itself. There's no everything other than ego. Nothing has any existence independent of ego. That's why when ego doesn't exist, nothing else exists. And then he says, he concludes that verse by saying, Adalal yadu idu endru nadale ovadal yavamenaor. Therefore, know that investigating what this is giving up everything. Investigating what this is means investigating ego. If we investigate ego, ego will thereby subside and dissolve back into its source. Tedinal otum pidicum. If sought, it takes flight, as he said in the previous verse. And when ego ceases to exist, everything else ceases to exist. So in order to know ourselves as we actually are, we not only need to give up ego, we need to give up everything else, because everything else exists only in the view of ego. So investigating ourselves is giving up everything. To the extent to which we turn our attention back within, to that extent does ego subside, and when ego subsides, everything else subsides along with it. As Bhagavan says, not only in verse 26 of Ulunaptu, he also says in the final paragraph of Nana, he says very, very clearly, Tan erundal sakalamam erum. If oneself rises, everything rises. Tan adanginal sakalam adangam. If oneself subsides, everything does subside. Oneself here, tan means oneself. There he's referring to ego. If we rise as ego, everything else appears. If we subside, everything else disappears. So, what is aware of everything other than ourselves is only ego. And its awareness of anything other than ourselves is an act of knowing. It's a mental activity. That is all of this, as Bhagavan says, the whole world is nothing but thoughts. It's nothing but mental activities, mental impressions, mental phenomena. So it all exists only in the view of ego. When we turn our attention within to know ourselves as we actually are, we thereby merge back into the pure awareness that we actually are, which doesn't know anything other than itself. And it doesn't even know itself by an act of knowing, it knows itself just by being itself. It there means ourself. What we actually are, we know ourselves as we actually are by being ourselves as we actually are. Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Arunachala Ramanaya.